The morning I drove my late wife's wristwatch to the repair shop, I told myself it was just something small I needed to do. Eleanor had worn that watch every single day for 31 years. It was a slim gold Seiko with a cracked crystal and a leather strap she'd replaced twice. She passed away 8 months before, quietly in her sleep, the doctor said. A cardiac event, sudden and unexpected. She was 62 years old, and she had been perfectly fine at dinner the night before. I am 67 now, retired from 40 years in municipal water management in Sudbury, Ontario. I have a house with a backyard that backs onto a small creek, a truck I don't drive much anymore, and a son named Trevor who called me every Sunday until he stopped. I want you to understand something before I continue. I loved my son. Past tense is not something I use carelessly. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because everything I am about to tell you will make more sense if you understand that I loved Trevor the way only a father who has watched a child grow from nothing into a man can love someone completely without condition. Or so I believed. The morning I drove my late wife's wristwatch to the repair shop, I told myself it was just something small I needed to do. Eleanor had worn that watch every single day for 31 years. It was a slim gold Seiko with a cracked crystal and a leather strap she'd replaced twice. She passed away 8 months before, quietly in her sleep, the doctor said. A cardiac event, sudden and unexpected. She was 62 years old, and she had been perfectly fine at dinner the night before. I am 67 now, retired from 40 years in municipal water management in Sudbury, Ontario. I have a house with a backyard that backs onto a small creek, a truck I don't drive much anymore, and a son named Trevor who called me every Sunday until he stopped. I want you to understand something before I continue. I loved my son. Past tense is not something I use carelessly. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because everything I am about to tell you will make more sense if you understand that I loved Trevor the way only a father who has watched a child grow from nothing into a man can love someone completely without condition. Or so I believed. The watch repair shop on Larch Street has been there since the late 80s. The owner, a man named Gerald Kowalski, had been a friend of our family for decades. He went to the same parish as Eleanor's parents. He fixed my father-in-law's pocket watch the year Eleanor and I got married. He is a small, careful man with thick glasses and hands that don't shake even in his 70s. When I walked in that Tuesday morning in March with Eleanor's Seiko in a small cloth bag, he looked at me the way people had been looking at me for 8 months, with that particular softness reserved for the recently widowed, and he said, "Come in, Daniel, come in." He set the watch on his examination mat and turned on his magnifying lamp. I sat in the wooden chair across from him the way I had sat there a dozen times over the years, waiting while he replaced a battery or adjusted a clasp. We talked about nothing in particular for a few minutes, the weather, the road construction on Elm Street. Then he went quiet in a way that felt different from his usual working silence. He looked up at me and then looked back down at the watch. Then he looked up again. He said, "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not react until I finish." I remember the feeling in my chest when he said that, like something cold settling in. He told me that Trevor had been in the shop 6 weeks earlier. He'd brought in a watch of his own, something with a broken crown, and while Gerald was working on it, Trevor had made conversation. It was normal conversation at first about me and how I was coping with Eleanor's death. Then Trevor had said something that Gerald had not been able to stop thinking about since. Trevor had said that he was worried about my health, that I had been forgetting things, and that the doctor had mentioned early cognitive decline. He mentioned he was considering whether it might be time to look into a power of attorney arrangement. He said he wanted to make sure my affairs were in order, that my estate was protected, and that I was being looked after properly.
Gerald had nodded along at the time. It had sounded like a concerned son talking, but then Trevor had said one more thing as he was leaving. He had paused at the door and said, almost as an afterthought, that he'd recently spoken to a lawyer about updating my will. His words were my will, not his own, and that he just wanted to make sure everything reflected my current wishes. Gerald said he'd almost let it go, almost told himself he was reading too much into it, but the phrase had stayed with him. Updating my will. Not his will, but mine. He reached under the counter and slid a folded piece of paper toward me. He said he had written down exactly what Trevor had said, word for word, the same day, because something in his gut had told him to. I read it 3 times. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 45 minutes before I went inside. I need to tell you about Trevor so you understand the full weight of what I was sitting with in that driveway. Trevor is my only child. He is 38 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Toronto, or he did. I'll explain that in a moment. He was not a difficult child. He was not a troubled teenager. He played hockey until he was 16, got decent grades, and went to Laurentian for 2 years before transferring to Ryerson. He graduated with a degree in business administration. Eleanor and I attended his convocation. She cried, and I took photographs. We were proud. When he was 29, he married a woman named Simone Archambault from Timmins originally, who worked in pharmaceutical sales. Eleanor adored Simone. They talked on the phone every week. When Trevor and Simone moved to Toronto, I thought it was just the ambition of young people wanting a bigger city and bigger opportunities. I supported it. Eleanor and I visited twice a year. Everything seemed fine. What I did not know, what Eleanor had apparently known and had been quietly trying to understand, was that Trevor and Simone had been living far beyond what their income could support. They had a condo in Liberty Village at a price point that made my eyes water when I eventually saw the mortgage documents. There were lease payments on 2 luxury vehicles and expensive vacations to Portugal and Japan. There was even a renovation that Trevor mentioned casually over Christmas dinner one year, as though spending $90,000 on a kitchen was an ordinary thing. I did not know the extent of it. Eleanor had mentioned once or twice that she was worried Trevor seemed stressed about money, but when I'd asked Trevor directly, he'd laughed it off. He said business was cyclical and that everything was fine. I believed him. After I read Gerald's note in that driveway, I went inside and I did something I had not done since Eleanor died. I went into her desk. Eleanor kept a small roll-top desk in the corner of the spare bedroom. She was meticulous about paperwork. Bills, correspondence, insurance documents, everything filed neatly in labeled folders. I had avoided that desk since the funeral because opening it felt like disturbing something I wasn't ready to handle yet. I found the folder almost immediately. It was labeled simply with my name in her handwriting, and it was sitting on top of everything else, as though she had placed it there deliberately and recently, knowing I would eventually find it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a printed email chain between Eleanor and a lawyer named Patricia Holt, dated 11 months before Eleanor died. The emails discussed Eleanor's concerns about Trevor's financial situation and his increasingly pointed questions about our estate. In one email, Eleanor had written that Trevor had asked her directly whether the house was paid off and what she estimated it was worth. She had written that it didn't feel like casual curiosity. Patricia Holt had recommended that Eleanor document her concerns and consider updating her will to include protective language around the estate. The second item was a handwritten note from Eleanor to me. I will not share everything she wrote because some of it is private in a way I want to keep between us, but she wrote that she was frightened, that she had seen something change in Trevor over the past 2 years, and that she didn't know what to do with what she was seeing. She wrote that she hoped she was wrong. She wrote that if she was reading this note, then something had happened and she was sorry she hadn't spoken to me directly. She had been trying to protect me from something she wasn't yet certain was real. The third item was a copy of a new will, signed and witnessed, dated 9 months before her death. Eleanor had changed her will without telling me. She had removed Trevor as executor and named Patricia Holt as executor instead. She had added specific language stating that if her death occurred under circumstances that were in any way unclear, a full review of her medical history and financial records was to be conducted before any distribution of the estate. I sat on the floor of that spare bedroom for a long time. Then I called Patricia Holt.
Patricia Holt is a quiet, precise woman in her late 50s who speaks the way people speak when they have spent decades choosing words carefully. She had been expecting my call. She told me she had actually tried to reach me twice in the weeks after Eleanor's funeral, but that Trevor had answered my phone both times and told her I was not available. I had not known she called because Trevor had not mentioned it. She told me that Eleanor had come to her with serious concerns about Trevor's behavior in the months before her death. She described an incident where Trevor had arrived at the house unexpectedly while I was away at a conference and had spent 3 hours going through files in my office. Eleanor had confronted him, and Trevor had said he was just trying to get organized and trying to help. Eleanor had not believed him. Patricia also told me something that made the floor feel unsteady under me. She said that Eleanor's death, while attributed to cardiac arrest, had some features that Eleanor herself had flagged as a concern months earlier. Eleanor had told Patricia that she had been experiencing unusual symptoms, fatigue, nausea, and occasional heart palpitations, and that her GP had not found a clear cause. Eleanor had not told me about the symptoms because she had not wanted to worry me while I was dealing with some health issues of my own that year. Patricia said carefully, choosing every word, that she was not making any accusation, but she said that Eleanor had wanted certain protections in place, and she said that she thought I should speak to someone. I called a detective named Sergeant Marlene Folds at the Greater Sudbury Police Service. The next morning, I brought Gerald's note, Eleanor's folder, and Patricia Holt's contact information. I sat across from Sergeant Folds in a small office that smelled like coffee and printer paper, and I told her everything. Sergeant Folds listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me several questions. Had Trevor had access to Eleanor's medications? Had there been any unusual purchases I was aware of in the period before Eleanor's death? Had Trevor been present in our home frequently in Eleanor's last months? The answer to all 3 questions was yes. Trevor had stayed with us for 3 weeks the previous spring, ostensibly because his condo was being remediated for mold. He had been in the house constantly. He had been helpful and attentive in a way that I had found touching at the time. He had cooked dinner several nights. He had offered to manage Eleanor's medications when she had her wrist surgery and needed to take several prescriptions simultaneously. Eleanor had declined, saying she preferred to manage it herself, but he had been present nearby every day. Sergeant Folds asked me to let her do some preliminary work before I contacted Trevor or said anything to anyone. She asked me to behave as normally as possible and to reach out to Trevor in my usual way so as not to raise any concern. That Sunday, I called Trevor as though nothing had changed. He answered on the second ring. He asked how I was doing. He sounded like my son. He sounded exactly like my son. I sat on the phone with him for 22 minutes, asking him about work and the weather in Toronto and whether he had watched the Leafs game. I felt something in me going very quiet, very cold, and very focused in a way I had not felt since I was a young man. I want to explain something about that feeling because I think it matters. It was not hatred. It was not rage. It was something more like the feeling you get when you are doing a very delicate and important job and you cannot afford a single mistake. It was a kind of terrible clarity. Eleanor had felt something was wrong, and she had prepared. She had protected me, even from beyond her own death. The least I could do was not waste what she had left me. 3 weeks later, Sergeant Folds called me and asked me to come in.
The toxicology results from Eleanor's exhumation had come back. This was something I had formally requested at Sergeant Fold's suggestion with the support of Patricia Holt in her capacity as executor. There were trace amounts of digoxin in Eleanor's tissue samples. Digoxin is a medication to treat heart conditions. Eleanor had no prescription for digoxin. She had no diagnosed heart condition that would warrant its use. In sufficient concentration or with certain interactions, it can cause cardiac arrest. In small, repeated doses over time, it is extremely difficult to detect without specifically testing for it. The pathologist who reviewed the results told the investigation that levels found were consistent with low-dose repeated administration over a period of weeks or months. It was not a single acute event, but something slower. I have a very clear memory of sitting in Sergeant Fold's office when she told me this. I remember the sound of a phone ringing somewhere down the hallway. I remember the grain of the wooden table. I remember thinking about how Trevor had stood at Eleanor's casket at the funeral with his hand on the edge of it, and how I had put my arm around him, and how he had leaned into me as though he was grieving. Sergeant Folds told me they were opening a formal homicide investigation. She also told me that in the course of looking into Trevor's finances, they had found something else. Trevor and Simone had separated 8 months earlier, shortly after Eleanor's death. Simone had retained a lawyer, and in the course of those proceedings had provided a statement describing several conversations in which Trevor had spoken about my estate. According to Simone's statement, Trevor had told her more than once that once things were settled with his mother, the financial pressure would ease. He said that the house in Sudbury alone was worth enough to clear everything, and that he just needed to be patient. Simone had not gone to the police at the time because she had not been certain what she was hearing. She had told herself she was misunderstanding him, but she had kept notes. She had kept dated notes in her phone in a memo application, recording what he had said and when he had said it. Eleanor had kept a folder. Simone had kept notes. The women in Trevor's life had both felt something was wrong, and both had quietly and carefully documented it. I have thought about that many times since. Trevor was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon in April at his condo in Toronto. I was not there. Sergeant Folds called me afterwards. She said he had not resisted. She said he had asked almost immediately to speak to a lawyer. She said he did not ask about me. He did not ask about me at all. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, which is saying something given what the preceding months had already been. I cooperated fully with the investigation. I gave statements and provided access to financial records, to the house, and to everything the Crown prosecutors needed. Patricia Holt navigated the estate side with a competence that made me understand why Eleanor had chosen her. There was a bail hearing. Trevor's lawyer argued for release pending trial on conditions. I submitted a victim impact statement opposing bail. I had not written many formal documents in my life. My career was in operations management, not paperwork. But I wrote that statement carefully. I wrote about Eleanor. I wrote about 31 years of marriage and a cracked watch face and a small gold Seiko and a spare bedroom desk that I hadn't been able to open for 8 months. I wrote about the folder she left me. I wrote about what it means to be protected by someone even after they are gone.
The trial took place the following January. It lasted 11 days. The Crown presented the toxicology evidence, Simone's testimony, Gerald's written account, the email chain between Eleanor and Patricia Holt, and the financial records showing the full extent of Trevor's debt. By the time of Eleanor's death, his debt had exceeded $400,000 across various lines of credit. There was a second mortgage on the condo that Simone had not known about, and a private loan from an individual the Crown described as a high-interest lender with connections to organized financial fraud. Trevor's lawyer argued that the digoxin could have been introduced to Eleanor's system through contamination or environmental exposure.
They questioned the reliability of tissue sample testing over an extended post-mortem period. They suggested that Simone's notes were the product of a bitter separation and could not be trusted. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the second afternoon, they returned a verdict of guilty on 1 count of first-degree murder. I was sitting in the front row of the gallery. I had a friend named Bob Tremaine sitting beside me. We had worked together for 20 years. He had driven me to every day of the trial. When the verdict was read, I did not cry. I had cried enough, I think. I sat very still, and I looked at the back of Trevor's head, and I thought about the note Eleanor had written me. I hoped she was wrong. That was what she had written. She had hoped she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. She had known, and she had still hoped. The judge sentenced Trevor to life with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. That was 14 months ago now. I still live in the house on the creek. I still have Eleanor's watch. Gerald repaired it. He replaced the crystal, cleaned the movement, and put a new strap on it. It sits on my dresser, and I wind it every morning. I don't wear it because it's not mine to wear, but I keep it running because it feels like the right thing to do. I have thought a great deal about what I want to say at the end of this, because I think there are things worth saying. If someone you love is trying to tell you something and they are not able to say it directly, listen to what they are doing instead of what they are saying. Eleanor could not bring herself to tell me she was frightened of our son, but she went to a lawyer. She changed her will. She built a file and left it where I would find it. She was telling me everything. I just didn't know how to listen yet. Document the things that feel wrong, even when you cannot yet name why they feel wrong. Eleanor did. Simone did. 2 women who had every reason to doubt themselves, to second-guess themselves, to decide they were being dramatic or unfair. And both of them wrote things down anyway. That documentation is the reason there was a conviction. Write it down, date it, keep it somewhere safe. If you are a parent, please understand that love without clear eyes is not protection. I loved Trevor without ever asking the hard questions. I accepted his reassurances because I wanted to. I did not look closely because looking closely felt disloyal. That instinct cost Eleanor her life. Love your children clearly. If something feels wrong, it is not a betrayal of love to look directly at it. And if you are ever sitting across from someone like Gerald Kowalski, someone who has written down a thing that bothered them and kept it, and eventually handed it to you across a wooden counter, please understand what kind of courage that takes. He could have talked himself out of it 100 times. He could have decided it was not his business or that he had misheard. He handed me that piece of paper anyway. Tell the people in your life when something feels wrong, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. Eleanor bought that watch in 1987, the year we got married. She wore it for 31 years. It kept perfect time. Some things are built to last. Make sure the things you build are worth keeping. Pay attention to the structures of your life, not just the ones made of brick and mortar, but the ones made of people and trust. That is where the foundation truly lies. Don't let the silence grow until it becomes a wall you cannot climb. I learned that far too late, but I hope you can learn it now. Take care of the ones who take care of you.